To our confirmation study on the Ten Commandments. This week we're looking at the sixth commandment, which is you shall not commit adultery. Kind of as we start wrestling with this, it's a really important topic. I want to just frame it with what's really at stake here. What's at stake in this commandment is your heart and your relationships. The two main things that are at stake is your heart and your relationships. Now, there are secondary effects that come out of this. For example, there's physical effects, there's social and financial effects that come out of breaking this commandment. But those aren't the main things, and that's not normally what we hear when we're talking about this topic. We're talking about adultery or having sex outside of marriage. Normally the focus is on those secondary things. The focus is on those physical effects. And so even within the church, whenever we're talking about this topic is, you shouldn't have sex because then you're going to get pregnant. And that's going to ruin your life and then no one's going to want you. There's no gospel in that. The gospel is that God wants us despite what we do. And so if we're trying to say, don't do this because then this is going to happen to you, and then by association, then that's going to ruin your life. Or don't do it because then you might get this disease or this infection, and that's going to ruin your life. That's going to impact you. That isn't really effective, nor is it really accurately reflective of what the Christian life is. Is that despite all the mistakes that we make, despite all of that, God still loves us, and our life isn't ruined. Yeah, there are consequences of what we have, but that isn't the motivating factor for why we obey this commandment. And so instead of talking about all those things that you normally hear about, we're going to focus again on the two things that are impacted the most, which is our heart and our relationships. And that there's a lot more at stake, is that this is an issue of disordered desires. So our desire for sex outside of marriage becomes ultimate, instead of putting that desire in the context that God has given that gift to us. Is that these desires get disordered, and our desire to follow God's plan because we love Him and He has the best plan for us, that gets, instead of being at the top of our life, that gets shifted down, and then our fleshly desires for sex, or really for any of the other commandments, that goes up. And all these are examples of the ways that our desires get disordered, get out of focus, get out of order. And then you see the consequences as a result. So in our world, this sexually craved culture, it's not going very well for us. We're seeing the effects of living outside of the best plan that God has given us. Because when we don't do this, so we suffer on an individual level as well as on a society level. So we see in our culture that there's marriages that are just broken because of living outside of this commandment. Is that there are teenagers that are living a lifestyle that's so focused on this. You look at in our media, almost any sitcom that you watch, what drives the people and what they're constantly searching for, it is all focused around this area, this topic. And we have awful statistics in our culture about percentage of people that are then addicted to sex, to internet pornography, to any of these different expressions of living outside of God's commandment. And it's killing people. It's killing relationships. It's killing hearts. It's breaking the system that God has set up for us. And so we see around us, there's just pause of broken people, broken messes because of living outside of the balance that God has given us. And so the first thing that we look at is that God not only comes into that brokenness with His Son, with His forgiveness, with His grace, with His mercy, and He restores people that have been broken by living outside of this commandment. But not only that, not only is there hope for us when we fall short, when we mess up, but there's also a better way. There's a better plan. There's a different desire. The only way to replace one set of desires is to replace them with a different set of desires that are more powerful than the other one. So we can't say, hey, just don't have sex outside of marriage because you might get sick, or you might get pregnant, or whatever. Those desires, for most people, aren't more powerful, more important than the desires that's leading them to the sin in the first place. And yet, if we introduce something more powerful, that's actually better for you, not just avoiding pain, but receiving gifts and blessings, that desire is more powerful than our innate sinful fleshly desire to do whatever we want. And so let's replace these desires that lead us to sin, that lead us ultimately to death. And let's trade them in for God's design, God's desires for us in regards to sexuality. And let me just lay it out right now, is that God's desire for you is not summed up in the word abstinence. It's just not. And yet that's what you hear. You hear abstinence only education. You hear, well, this is what you need to do. Yet abstinence is not the summary word. Because here's the issue if we teach abstinence only in education. That, well, just don't have sex before marriage. I'm done. Just don't do it. That's fine. There's a whole spectrum of things before you actually get to intercourse. There's a whole spectrum of different ways that we can sin sexually, that we can be led into lust, that we can break this commandment before you even get to that. So we have good, meaning Christian couples that have been told, hey, don't have sex outside of marriage. But all the stuff before that, they have no idea. They're guessing. And so what ends up being driving that is then our earthly, our fleshly desires. And that brings in all that brokenness, all that shame, all that guilt that God says, if you live within my bounds, you avoid all of that. And you just receive the blessing, the gift that I have for you. So we see that there's a context that God has given us. And that we can't just say, well, don't do that. That doesn't work. We need a new desire, a new plan. And it's not just abstinence, because that opens up a big gray area for us. Where then our sinful flesh will take us all the way to that point right in front of it. And then at that point we don't know how to control our desires, and so many Christian couples even lose out on that goal. Because they've gotten as close to the line as they possibly can, without any self-control, without any accountability, without any real new desire that replaces their old desires. And so even that as a goal, it doesn't work. So let's look back to God's plan and see what's God's desire for us. And his desire is again summed up in one word as purity. It says that we may lead a sexually pure and decent life in what we say and do. Desire is purity, or chastity, to use a little bit of an older term, is purity. And that hits everything on the spectrum, on the continuum. Anything from intercourse all the way down to just holding hands and everything in between. That the goal in all of these things is purity. It is to remain pure in all of these things. And that this is the best plan for your life, for your heart, and for your relationships. And so let's look first at your heart. Because your heart is at stake in this. Because relationships seem to be all about your heart, your emotions, your feelings. So when we're in a relationship, we feel good, our heart's great, and yet when it comes crashing down, when there's a breakup, people are heartbroken. And yet that is magnified even more when that relationship was living outside of God's design. Is that sex isn't just a physical thing, it's also an emotional and a spiritual issue. And so in a sexual relationship before marriage that ends up dissolving, that ends up breaking up, that heartache is so much more. And then the desire of the heart is not for a partner to do the ministry of God with. The desire then turns into what we see in the culture, which is simply a sexual desire. And so we're no longer seeing people as people. We're seeing them as objects for our pleasure, for our desires. So not only does our heart get twisted, the way we see people get twisted, and then the effects of these different sins get magnified in our life, it also affects our relationships. Is that when our focus becomes on the physical aspect of relationships, when that becomes our main desire and our driving point for what we do, our relationships suffer. Our relationships suffer, and there's a lot of brokenness that comes in from this. Is that no longer are they a valuable child of God to be cherished and loved and protected, it's that they are now just an object. They're just an object. And then from those relationships not working, because relationships don't work when we treat each other as objects, then again it goes back to our heart. It goes back to our heart, and our heart is changed. Our heart is messed up when we live outside of this bound. And yet, if we live inside the boundaries, in the gift that God has given us, in the committed relationship, male and female together in marriage, with that commitment, when there's that high commitment that says, I'm going to be with you no matter what happens, as the commitment is as high as it can go, then the intimacy matches with that. And it's a beautiful design. It's a beautiful picture of here's how that works. And then you don't get that baggage, that guilt, that, well, what if they're going to leave me? They're not. So it becomes an expression, a gift of the love that God has given us. And so it's this beautiful design that has been so warped by our own sin in our own lives and in our culture. And so we praise God that He takes broken things, He takes broken people, and He makes them new through His Word. So in the areas where we have failed to uphold the sixth commandment, where we have thought our plan is better, and then we've realized through the consequences, through our broken hearts, through our broken relationships, that this isn't the best thing for us, that we return to Him in repentance, we receive His forgiveness, and we let Him make us new. That we let Him make us new. Is that God's desire, God's design for us to be pure. And those desires, that plan, that gift, that's then more powerful than the simple desires of the flesh. We need to keep continually reminding ourselves of that new desire, of that new goal, of that new way of looking at the gifts that God has given us. Is that in the context of marriage, it is a good, beneficial, and great gift. And so we see in the context of what God has given us, that we trade in our old desires, which bring sin and brokenness and death. We trade them in for God's beautiful plan, which brings life and is a gift, in which husband and wife love and honor each other unconditionally all the time as they're trusting in the Lord, saying that His plan is good. And so in the meantime, until we're living in this context of our life, in the meantime, we trust in the Lord that His plan is good, His plan is right, and that our love for the Lord leads us to lead a sexually pure and decent life in what we say and do. That we respond to His grace by saying, I trust you. I trust your plan for this area of my life and every area of my life, because you, God, are good. And you know all things, and you know that this is the best choice for my life. So I'm going to follow you, Lord. I'm going to trust in you, even when it looks all around me that there's all sorts of other options that are better. I'm going to trust in your word. I'm going to trust in your promise. I'm going to hold on to that and live in the context of the gifts that you have given us.